Thanks for having me. It is a great pleasure to be here. I'm Yuxi from University of West Ontario, and today I'm going to talk about land and the rise in the dispersion of house prices and rents across cities in the US. We all know that shelter cost is a major part of household expenditure. Therefore, understanding why it differs across cities is important for household welfare. How do we measure it? Well, in the literature, some people use prices while others use rents. But when we look at the distributions of prices and rents across cities, we can find that these two distributions are different and they change in different ways over time, which means using prices and rents interchangeably could be problematic, and it is important to understand this difference because it has implications on ownership decisions, as well as evaluating life quality at different places. So in this paper, I document 3 stylized facts about the joint distribution of the two shelter costs, prices and rents across cities, and I propose a mechanism that can quantitatively account for all of these observations. So what are the observations? First, we know that both prices and rents vary a lot across cities, but prices are more dispersed. Here, I measure dispersion with the coefficient of variation, which is the standard deviation divided by the mean. So for all of the cities in my sample, for each city is represented by 2 numbers, one for price, one for rent. And then I collect prices and rents for all the cities, calculate the mean, standard deviation, and coefficient of variation. In the year 1980, the coefficient of variation of prices is 80% higher compared to rents. And the dispersion of prices and rents grow at different rates. From the year 1980 to 2010, the coefficient of variation of prices has almost doubled, while the coefficient of variation of rents has only increased by 50%. While the last observation is a high correlation between prices and rents across cities, cities that have higher rents usually have even higher prices. Let's compare New York and Kansas City. In the year 2010, the rent in New York is 60% higher compared to Kansas City, while the price in New York is more than 3 times as high as Kansas City. Just to be clear, when I talk about price, it's going to be price of a standard owner-occupied unit that's a detached home. When I talk about rent, it's going to be rent of a standard rental unit. So the main mechanism proposed in this paper that helps to account for these observations is based on the observation that most of the owners live in detached homes, while most of the renters live in apartments, which means the commonly used prices and rents actually capture the cost of dwellings that differ in land use. Why is this important? Well, we know that houses and apartments differ in the use of land, and land is the most scarce and valuable resource in big cities. The values of land vary a lot across cities. In cities like New York and LA, where the land price is super high, we see apartments economize on land use by building up. We see a lot of skyscrapers. But houses cannot do that, because by definition, it needs a piece of land to sit on, and there are regulations that prevent us from using less land, such as the minimum lot size zoning regulation. Therefore, due to the intensive use of land in building houses, the cost of building houses in these big cities is disproportionately higher compared to the cost of building apartments. In order to quantitatively evaluate this mechanism, I propose a city-level lifecycle housing tenure choice model. The demand side is pretty standard. I have a bunch of households who choose between buying a house and renting an apartment, and decide to buy and rent based on their age, income, and wealth. And the supply side is the innovative part of this paper. I have 2 production functions with the same inputs but different land shares. The production function for owner-occupied houses has a higher land share. And here is how intuitively it gives us the 3 observations. because houses and apartments are built using the same inputs, land and material. In equilibrium, the cost of building houses and the cost of building apartments are going to be functions of the land values and the material values. And this gives us the high correlation between prices and rents. At the same time, because the production function for houses has a higher land share, which means when land value vary across cities, we see price vary more compared to rents. And by the same logic, when land value changes over time, we see price grows more compared to rents. And that gives us the first and second observation. Prices are more dispersed compared to rents, and over time, the dispersion of price has increased more compared to rents. I calibrated the model to each of the largest 181 metropolitan areas in the US in 1980. I target at house prices, rents, and the fraction of households living in detached or attached homes. So by definition, it can perfectly match the distributions of prices and rents in the year 1980. And the question is whether we can account for the cross-time change of these two distributions. In order to answer this question, I feed in the model factors that may affect the land demand and therefore the housing demand and therefore the land market. So I changed the economic fundamentals like population, income, and residential land supply to the 2010 level. At the same time, to capture the impact of mortgage innovation on the housing market, I lowered down payment from 20 to 10%. I find that changing these factors can account for 82% of the increase in the price dispersion, 56% increase in the rent dispersion, and 90% increase in the dispersion of price-rent ratios. And this is kind of interesting because it basically says increasing price-rent ratios in some of the big metropolitan areas in the US can actually be accounted for by economic fundamentals, which challenges the view that price-rent ratio can be used as a convenient indicator for housing bubble. In addition, the model does a good job in predicting prices, rents, and the price-rent ratios for each of the individual cities pretty well in the year 2010. So my project contributes to the understanding of the cross-city variation in levels and growth rates of price-rent ratios. It introduces some flexibility. It allows price-rent ratio to vary with land values. And when we look at a cross-city variation where the land value varies, this relationship may differ across cities. Also, over time, when land value changes, this relationship can also change. It complements the literature focusing on the rise in the price dispersion across cities. I extend the analysis to the change in the dispersion of another type of shelter costs, the rent and the relationship between these two costs. It contributes to the estimating housing production function. So most of the paper in the literature focus on the estimating the production function for houses. In this project, I also estimate the land share of in producing apartments as well, and I find that the land share in producing apartments is like about a half of the land share in producing houses. It complements the literature on that emphasizes the importance of residential land values on housing price dynamics. So I go one step further. I ask how land values are determined. So the model in my paper allows me to have a mapping from economic fundamentals to land values. So here is the roadmap of my presentation. First, I'm going to show you some empirical evidence that supports my main mechanism, and then I'll talk about the model, calibration, quantitative exercise, and then I'll conclude. First, I want to show you the high correlation between prices and rents. In the year 1999, Glaser and Gurko wrote a paper arguing that because prices and rents represent the cost of different types of dwellings, they are not directly comparable. What I find is that prices and rents are highly correlated. In the year 1980, the correlation between prices and rents is like 0.7, and in the year 2010, it has increased to 0.9. Similar patterns can be found in the growth rates. So here I plot the rent growth against the price growth from the year 1980 to the year 2010. You have similar patterns, I'm pretty sure, and I checked for this correlation, I checked the mean price, median, like mean price, mean rent, median price, median rent, and the like fixed quality price and rents. We find like high correlation for all of them. The reason I stop at the year 2010 is because for the year, I'm using American Community Survey. After the year 2010, they switched the definition of metropolitan areas. And basically, these high correlations suggest that there is some underlying factor that bridges these two shelter costs. And I'm arguing that this factor, one of the most important factor is the land. The model, like the mechanism, also suggests that when underlying land value changes, price growth more than rent because the cost of constructing houses grows faster than the cost of constructing apartments. And it would be cool if we can do some direct comparison. So here, I show you the price growth for single-family detached home against the price growth for multifamily buildings for a limited number of cities where we have enough owners who report the value of their condos. I find that for all of these cities, the price growth for single-family detached home is stronger compared to the price growth for multifamily buildings, which supports the main mechanism. Mechanism also suggests that prices are more responsive compared to rent towards changing land values because the land input for building houses is less responsive. So therefore, I compare the land input for building 1 square feet of living space for apartments and houses against the local population density. So I use population density as an approximation for the land scarcity. As we can see from the red panel, a 1% increase in population density is associated with about 10% drop in the land use for building apartments. But the land use for building houses is not very responsive to local population density, which is consistent with my story. So let me share more details about my model. The model helps us to determine how the demand of land is associated with economic fundamentals. It has 2 mappings. The first one maps from economic fundamentals like population and income to demand of houses and demand of apartments through standard housing tenure choice model. And the second mapping merges these 2 demand into demand of residential land through the 2 production functions. So after we figure out how the demand of land is determined, we can combine it with the land supply, which is observed in the data, and then we get a better idea about how land values are determined. So each city is represented by 1 isolated island. Each city contains 1 general equilibrium model. Households in a city choose between buying a house and renting an apartment, and the size to buy and rent based on age, income, and wealth. I have competitive developers who use land and material to build houses and apartments through 2 different production functions. The land supplies are exogenous, and they are calibrated to the residential land supply for observed residential land used in each city. Let's take a closer look at the household problem. So for a household on island K, he draws initial wealth and income shock once he's born. He lives up to J periods, enjoys a hump-shaped income profile. He derives utility from consumption and housing services. At the beginning of each period, he chooses consumption, saving, and housing asset in the future to maximize his current utility and expected future values. If he's an owner, the housing service he's going to receive is the size of the house that he owns. If he's a renter, he's going to decide the size of the apartment he wants to rent. Owners has this ownership premium, which captures the utility difference between living in a owner-occupied unit and a rental unit. Household's income depends on his age, which city he lives in, and the income shocks. Only owners can borrow, and they can borrow up to a certain fraction of the value of his housing asset, which is equivalent to a down payment requirement. And here is the housing supply side. We have a bunch of developers. For house developers, they buy land from land market at price Q and material from material market at price phi. They produce houses according to a Cobb-Douglas production function with Lingxiao alpha. And there is a city-specific minimum lot size zoning requirement which says the land use per house cannot fall below a specific level. After they finish the house, they sell it to owners. And we have apartment developers who buy land from land market, material from material market, and construct apartments according to a Cobb-Douglas production function with a Lingxiao rule. A is what I call relative productivity. It captures the fact that a standard detached home uses more land and more material compared to a standard apartment. After they finish the project, they rent it to renters, and these developers collect the rent every period. They are going to be risk neutral. In equilibrium, because housing markets are assumed to be competitive, we have the housing price equals to the total cost of building that houses. When the minimum lot size does not bind, it's going to be a function of land value, material value, and house size. It's going to be a linear function of house size. When it binds, it's going to be a convex function of house size. So the minimum lot size requirement puts a floor on the total cost of building a house. Similar thing happens for the cost of building apartments. So the net present value of rents equals to the total cost of building apartments, and it's going to be a function of land value, material value, and the apartment size. In my model, I only considered one regulation, that's the minimum lot size regulation, and the land are kind of reusable. So I don't distinguish like land that can be only used for apartments from the land that can be used for houses, and that's actually like another project I'm working on here. So what defines a city? Cities differ in total population, average household income, and the ownership premium, residential land supply, material price, and the minimum lot size requirement. So there are two sets of parameters. There are parameters that are identical across cities, and they are determined outside of the model. For example, for the parameters in the utility function and budget constraint, they come directly from the literature. Parameters in the production functions, the two land shares, and the relative productivity is estimated using cross-city variation in house prices, rents, and land values. And there are area-specific parameters, the ownership premium and the minimum lot size requirement. They are calibrated to the home ownership rates of different age groups. Intuitively, when we increase the ownership premium, everyone finds that owning is super attractive. Then home ownership rates for all age groups will increase. But when we increase the minimum lot size requirement, it's going to affect the low-income households disproportionately. When we increase minimum lot size, the cost of building smaller homes that don't require a large amount of land input will increase. But the cost of building large ones are not going to be affected. Therefore, when we increase minimum lot size requirement, home ownership rate for the low-income group, the young households, is going to fall. But it's going to have a smaller impact on middle-aged ones. And that's how I identify these two parameters for each individual city. So how did I estimate the land shares? In equilibrium because prices and rents are going to be functions of land values and material values. Basically, a 1% increase in land values will be associated with alpha percent increase in house prices and the rho percent increase in the apartment rent. Alpha and rho are the two land shares in these two production functions. So that basically tells us if we regress prices and rent separately on the land values, we will be able to figure out these two parameters. And that's exactly what I do. I regress prices and rents on the transaction-based land values provided by Aubry in the year 2010. I use the year 2010 because Aubry's data set runs from 2006 and 26, I think. Of course, there is endogeneity problem because I allow the material price to vary, but we don't observe the material price here. So it is possible that material price is correlated with land values. So in order to deal with this endogeneity concern, I instrument land values with the geographic constraint on the fraction of developable land in each city. I find that no matter which approach we go after, OLS or IV, the land share in producing houses is twice as big as the land share in producing apartments. Let me provide more evidence from the literature that may support the estimation of these two land shares. So in the literature, people find that in the presence of demand shocks or supply changes, price change more compared to rents. And my mechanism suggests that it is supposed to happen, because when something changes in the housing market, it will be absorbed by the land market. Land value will change, and price is going to change more compared to rents because of the difference in land shares. How much? My estimation tells me that when underlying land value changes with economic fundamentals, price is going to grow 90% higher, faster compared to rents. And this is consistent with what we find in the literature. So Saiz finds that the impact of changing income or immigration on the median house value is 40 to 80% larger than median rent. Andre finds that the elasticity of price with respect to land scarcity is twice as big as the elasticity of rent. And in the recent paper, Greenwald and Gurin finds that when we increase the supply of mortgage, the price is going to grow 60% faster compared to rents. And in a more aggregate setting, Miao, Wang, and Jia find that when the correlation between the trended output and price-rent ratio is 0.5, which suggests that in the long run, when output grows, price-rent ratio is going to increase, which is consistent with what I find here. Model fit, by definition, it can fit prices and rents perfectly for the baseline year for all of the cities. And the estimated relative productivity A is 1.3, which suggests that standard owner-occupied units take more land and more material compared to a standard rental apartment. The ownership premium is 1.7 on average, and it varies across cities, which means owners derive more utility from living in an owned detached home. And this ownership premium differ across cities. So let's look at the model fit for the other targeted moments, the fraction of households living in detached homes. As we can see, it does a good job in matching the mean and standard deviation of these three moments, like fraction of households living in detached home for young, middle-aged, and old households. And here I compare the model-generated home ownership rate for each age group with what we see in the data. As we can see, they line up pretty well. Each bubble represents one city, and a 45-degree line is here to facilitate the comparison. As we can see, the model does a good job in matching the home ownership rate of young, middle-aged, and old households. So in the quantitative exercise, I'm trying to see whether the model can give us a large increase in the price dispersion and a relatively moderate increase in the rent dispersion at the same time. So I fit in the model population, income, and residential land supply from the year 2010. I lowered the down payment requirement from 20 to 10%. And then I solve for the equilibrium land price and combine it with the material price. I calculate the price for a standard detached house, rent for a standard apartment for each city in my sample. I find that the model can account for 82% of the increase in the price dispersion, 56% increase in the dispersion of rents, and 90% of the increase in the dispersion of price-rent ratio. At the same time, it can account for 37 to 56% of the increase in levels. How about each individual city? So here I compare the model simulated price in the year 2010 with what we see in the data. Again, each bubble represents one city, and this is a 45-degree line. As we can see, it does a good job in predicting prices for each individual city in the year 2010. The correlation is like 0.9, and it does a good job in predicting rents for each individual city as well, with a correlation about 0.8, and it does a good job in predicting price-rent ratio for each individual city, with a correlation about 0.8. So let me conclude. In this project, I find that difference in the land intensity between owner-occupied and rental units is important for understanding the cross-sectional and cross-time variation of the two shelter cost, price, and rents, and the relationship between them. It has some implications on computing CPI, the cost of housing services. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics use two methods. The first one is rent of primary residence. That's basically the rent of less land-intensive apartments. And I show you in this paper that the cost of constructing houses can deviate from the cost of constructing apartments when underlying land value changes due to this land use difference. Therefore, when we use the rent of primary residence to approximate the user cost of owner-occupied dwellings, we can be, underestimated in big cities where the land value is rising. And in the second approach, what they call owner's equivalent rent. They ask the owners, if you put your house in the market, how much rent would you expect to get? But if it depends on the owner's answer. If their answer is based on the equilibrium market rent, which mainly comes from the rent of apartments, we are basically going back to the first point. We can underestimate the growth rate of the user cost of owner-occupied dwellings in cities where the land market is where the land price is going up, like Los Angeles. It has some implications on the interpretation of price-rent ratio. Previously, people use it as an indicator of housing bubble, both in academics and in business price. And I show you that it can increase with land values. Therefore, next time when we see a rise in price-rent ratio, before we get panic about whether there is a bubble in the housing market, we should check whether land has become scarcer, and this can be done through the lens of my model. Thank you.
Well, thank you to the organizers for asking me to discuss this very ambitious and complicated paper. It was actually a pleasure to read, and I commend Yuxi for a very nice, complicated, lots of moving parts to this paper. So my marked up paper version of this has got comments on every page, and some of this is just I'm not paying close enough attention to the words. So I'm only going to comment on a few aspects of the paper. There are lots of things going on, and I encourage you to read this paper because it has a lot of insight, but I'm sort of not totally sure how it fits into the literature. So let me just proceed. First of all, there's a basic question here, which is, why is it the case that rentals are almost always in multifamily and single-family properties are almost always owner-occupied? And everybody needs a great unpublished paper, and I have one, which which was written with Lynne Fisher, and some of you I think know this paper. And because Lynne is a perfectionist, and it takes us at least 10 years to write every paper that we do, this has not been published yet. It was on a third round at a journal, and we just stopped working on it because she's trying to save the world, right? So, and I'm not, so I'm not a perfectionist. So anyway, okay, so what does this paper do? It compares the behavior and dispersion of prices and rents. It takes some kind of very standard data from the census and AHS, and there's some other stuff to generate some repeat stuff on there for prices and rents. But here's the problem that I'm having, the 30,000 foot problem I'm having with the paper, is that these prices and rents are not comparable because they're from different kinds of property, right? So to me, this was like comparing the dividends from a share of Apple stock. I don't even know if Apple has dividends, but and the Amazon stock price. So there's a flow value and a stock value, and they're from different kinds of assets. One's a single family rental, and one's an apartment in a multi-unit building. So there's actually two empirical things going on. One is that you are, if I was going to analyze this data, I would think of it as two different problems. One is when we normally compare rents and prices and talk about the rent-price ratio, we're usually talking about it in terms of the same property, right? And if you're going to talk about bubbles, it's not the rent of one kind of building versus the price of another kind of unit. It's for identical properties. And then I would want to, if I was doing this with this data, I would say, well, then let's compare the rent or the price of these different properties. So I think there's something missing here in that sense. So because what we would normally do is, as it says, they normally model the rent and price of the same asset. And for this, we have a theory. It's the Gordon growth model, which says that the rent-price ratio of the same unit should be equal to this discount rate, this R minus G, where G is this expected appreciation rate. And we have lots of literature on this, and we even have empirical investigations of this first bullet. I think this paper by Brack was the first in Real Estate Economics in 2015, but there's been others, and so Baltaji and Jing Li have a paper. This is using London data, this is using Singapore, and I grant you that these studies don't have land because they are rents and prices of units in multi-unit buildings, but they are sales and then subsequent rents investors buy these properties and they subsequently rent, and they scraped listings to find rents and prices on the same properties. And Brack in particular, that's the one I know better, examines how the rent-price ratio for the same unit varies with the characteristics of that unit. And so this is kind of getting at what Yuxi is doing, but in a way that's kind of more comfortable for people studying real estate. I mean, so I would encourage her to kind of take account of this literature, because this is totally missing from her study. She doesn't do this at all. Okay, so there's a lot of comments here. But the one I want to point at here is that this is how rental units get priced. And I just want to show you that there is a constant discount rate here. That discount rate does not depend on anything, and it doesn't depend on the G, the expected appreciation, which is the way we would talk about variation in what is effectively a cap rate across different assets. And so we're totally out of that world, because both the price of owner-occupied, and that's the largest touch screen I've ever seen. And the rent in rental buildings are both tied down by construction costs. Here it's directly, and here it's just saying that the present value of all future rents discounted at a common rate is equal to the construction cost of a unit in a multifamily setting. Okay, so that's kind of my big comment, right? There's some other things that I wasn't quite sure about. Okay, so here's the production function for owner-occupied single family and renter-occupied multifamily. And they're both Cobb-Douglas production functions. they have different value shares. And then the rental production function is pre-multiplied by this parameter A. And here's what she says in the paper. A captures the fact that a rental apartment uses less material and less land compared to a standard house due to the physical differences between the buildings. And so I kind of didn't get that, and maybe it's just my careless reading, but it seemed to me that gets it kind of backwards, because what this is saying, A is greater than 1, and in the simulations it's like 1.3. What this is saying is that land and materials are more productive in the production of rental housing. And I didn't quite get that. Why is that the case? And I'm sure, A is estimated, it comes out greater than 1. But I kind of want to know why it's greater than 1. And I don't think it has anything to, well, maybe it does have something to do with they're using less material and less land. But I don't know, I didn't understand that. And I didn't understand it in particular. Well, that's another slide. Okay, so I'll get to that, back to that in a second. All right, so this is not about rent and price, okay? What this is about large versus small, more versus less dense. And it's not even really about multi or single family. It's about looking at two different assets, one of which has a lot of land and the other which doesn't have a lot of land. Looking at how land values change over time, and asking why those things are more or less dispersed. And so house prices are more dispersed because they have more land, and land is more dispersed, versus multifamily have it using very little land. Land disperses, but rents don't disperse as much as prices. Okay, well, we know about that too, because we have plenty of literature that talks about price dispersion caused by different land values. And in particular, I'm glad Chris is here, because he had one of the first papers on this. It was one of the first papers I edited for Real Estate Economics. So Bostic, Longhofer, and Redfern talk about land leverage hypothesis, which is basically the same idea, that land prices cause dispersion in house prices, basically. And there's been some follow-up on that. So there's a paper that kind of takes the same tack by Steve Barassa et al. And then there's this kind of new paper, which I think is going underappreciated. I think it's a very clever paper that talks about depreciation rates of rental property versus owner-occupied property, and that the difference is in the depreciation rates actually gets traced back to differing land intensities. And so, and you can make, there's a lot going on in this paper that I think maybe we're not appreciating as much. So what we need from this paper is a better sense of what this paper brings to the table by looking at, and what it brings to the table ostensibly is that if your mother asked you, why are prices more dispersed than rents? What your mother is saying is she's looking at prices as generated by this data, and she's looking at rents of a different kind of property, rent, generated by data that we understand. And you got to say, Mom, there's two parts to this. And so if you want to know, well, I'm getting off the track here because I'm thinking about my mom, who's actually, well, anyway. So it's taking common data and saying, why is it different? And it's ignoring one of the reasons why it's different. How much time have I got? 1 minute, maybe? No, 3. Okay, so there were other unclear things in the paper, and it's just because the paper's so dense and maybe I'm not capturing everything in my reading. I didn't understand how tenure choice was made. I assume that what it looks like is that period by period, people are deciding whether or not to rent or own. So you're not capturing persistence in being an owner. You're not capturing transition costs. It looks like people are recontracting housing every single period, right? So that's kind of unrealistic. We don't know, I don't know about how we transit from one unit to another. There is transactions cost, but are people transacting every period or are they staying in the same house? There's depreciation of housing in the model, but I didn't understand whether housing was durable or not. I guess basically that's my question, whether housing is durable or not. Okay, so there's new construction every period, but it's added to the stock and some disappears. Okay, that wasn't incredibly clear, but maybe it's just because my eye wandered down the page. But it wasn't clear how long do houses last. I mean, a lot of that was just kind of glided over, and I think it needs more explanation. And here's this utility function for housing. This is the utility you get from housing, and you just get H if you rent, and then you get a bonus. If you're an owner, you get a bonus. But she skipped over this part in deference to her discussant. But this part is the reduction in utility you get from ownership if you're over a certain age, which, you know, like there was something about snow shoveling in the paper, that old people can't shovel snow as well, and my feelings were hurt.
California.
Yes, exactly. Mow the lawn. I don't do that either. So this thing here is supposed to capture the quality difference between a standard owner-occupied house and a standard rental house, and how residents on an island evaluate this quality difference. I totally agree with that. The device that I've used in some recent papers is to argue that what makes ownership different is you have option values, that you have the power to do things to your house that you can't do if you're a renter, and that's what makes the utility higher. So there's some literature by John Clapp on this, and so that's how I would phrase this. Okay. But if this thing's greater than 1, how does that square with the higher productivity of capital land and rental production? So you can't have both, I don't think. And you talk in a footnote, I found this later. There's a footnote in there on how you can't really identify both A, which is the productivity parameter for rentals, and this thing. I don't think they can both be bigger than 1. It doesn't sound right for owner occupation to have higher utility because of the structure, and then say that capital and land in rental production has a higher productivity. That didn't make any sense. But otherwise, great paper and highly recommended. Thank you.